What happens when the man chosen by God becomes your greatest nightmare? We often hear of King David's glory, his songs, and his repentance. But the version you've been told is missing a victim. It's missing the screams that were never heard, and the blood that was shed in the shadows of the palace. This isn't just a story of a king's mistake. It is a story of a woman's world being systematically dismantled by the one person who was supposed to protect it. It is a story where a single glance from a balcony led to a funeral, a fallen dynasty, and a scar on history that never truly healed. It began on a night that should have been silent, a night where the air in Jerusalem tasted of jasmine and impending doom. My husband Uriah was away at the front lines, bleeding for a kingdom that was already preparing to betray him. In his absence, the rooftop of our home was my only sanctuary, my only cathedral of peace. As I bathed under the vast, watchful eyes of the stars, I felt hidden. I thought the darkness was my veil, a silent protector keeping the world's demands at bay. But as the cool water hit my skin, I felt a sudden icy shiver. It was the primitive instinct that screams when you are no longer alone. I realized then that my safety was nothing but a fragile illusion. I looked up not at the heavens, but toward the looming silhouette of the royal palace. There on the high terrace he stood. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them piercing, possessive, and inescapable. I saw the rhythmic glint of gold reflecting the dying light, the king's crown. He wasn't just looking, he was hunting. In that moment, the universe shifted its tracks. I wasn't a wife, a woman, or even a person anymore. I was a target in the sights of absolute power. How do you hide when the man who wants you owns the very ground you stand on? I hurried inside, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against the cage of my ribs. I locked the doors, but in my soul I knew. The predator had seen his prey, and the trap was already set. The night did not bring the mercy of sleep. It brought the cold, rhythmic thud of iron against stone. I lay in the darkness of my room, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs that I could feel the pulse in my fingertips. Then the sound that shattered my world, the heavy synchronized march of the king's guard, echoing through the narrow streets of Jerusalem. This wasn't a social call. This was a siege. When the first blow struck my door, the entire house seemed to groan in protest. "Open, in the name of the king," a voice bellowed, cold and hollow, stripped of all human kindness. My servants, pale with terror, withdrew the heavy bronze bolts. I stood at the top of the stairs, my fingers digging into the cold stone railing, watching as 4 armed men flooded into my home. Their torches hissed and spat, casting long, distorted shadows that looked like monsters devouring my walls. They didn't look at me with the respect due to a soldier's wife. They looked at me like a prize to be collected. "The king demands your presence at the citadel," the commander stated, his eyes as hard as the steel at his hip. I looked at that sword, the same kind of blade my husband Uriah was using at that very moment to defend this king's throne. The bitter irony felt like ash in my throat. I tried to find my voice to demand why a woman of no political rank was being hunted like a criminal at midnight. But the words died before they could be spoken. In Israel, David's word was not just law, it was destiny. To refuse was to invite ruin, not just for myself, but for my husband and my entire family. As they marched me out into the chilling night air, I saw my neighbors peeking through their shutters, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and paralyzing fear. No one moved to help. No one dared to speak. I was being abducted in broad daylight, under the guise of royal authority. The walk to the palace felt like a march to a scaffold. Each step away from my home felt like I was shedding a piece of my soul. The wind howled through the limestone arches of the city, sounding like the collective weeping of 1,000 betrayed ancestors. When we reached the massive golden gates of the palace, they swung open with a slow, ominous groan that vibrated in my chest. They didn't open to welcome a guest. They opened to swallow a victim. I looked up at the towering moonlit battlements and realized the chilling truth. Once those gates closed behind me, the Bathsheba who lived in the light would be gone forever. I was stepping into the den of a lion, who had forgotten that a crown is not a license to steal a human soul. The trap had finally closed. The doors of the inner chamber closed with a thud that echoed like a gavel sentencing me to a life I never asked for. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cedar and burning myrrh, a fragrance so sweet it felt suffocating. Gold was everywhere, reflecting off the walls, the furniture, and the man who sat by the window. King David did not look like the monster I had imagined while walking through the dark streets. He looked calm. He looked regal. But as he turned to face me, I saw the truth in his eyes. It wasn't love that burned there. It was a terrifying, unchecked hunger. "Do not be afraid, Bathsheba," he said, his voice as smooth as polished silk. But how could I not be afraid? The very kindness in his tone was a weapon. It was the kindness of a spider inviting a fly into its web. He began to speak of my beauty, comparing it to the moonlight on the hills of Judah. But every compliment felt like a violation. I stood there trembling, my hands hidden in my sleeves, so he wouldn't see the terror shaking my frame. I thought of Uriah, his courage, his loyalty, his scent of leather and sweat from the battlefield. I tried to speak his name to remind the king that I belonged to a man who was currently risking his life for the crown. But David silenced me with a single raised hand. In that moment, the power imbalance was a physical weight in the room. He reminded me without ever raising his voice that he was the king. He was the one who could grant life or command death. He spoke of his favor, but I knew the price of royal favor was my soul. The luxury of the palace felt like a gilded cage, and the silence between us was a battlefield where I had already lost. There was no negotiation here, no choice. I realized that to the world, David was a hero who killed giants, but in this private room, he was a man who used his crown to crush the will of a defenseless woman. As the candles flickered low, the realization sank in. I was no longer a person in this room. I was a conquest. The giant slayer had become the oppressor, and I was the trophy he had decided to claim at any cost. The days inside the palace didn't pass. They crawled like a predator stalking its prey. I was surrounded by a luxury that felt like an insult, silks that burned my skin and wine that tasted of iron. David had returned to his throne, playing the part of the righteous shepherd of Israel, while I remained a ghost, haunting the corridors of his private chambers. But the true horror arrived with the rising sun of a morning that shattered my soul. The nausea in my stomach wasn't just fear anymore. It was life. I was pregnant. In that heartbeat, the golden floors of the palace felt like the lid of a coffin. Under the law of Moses, the penalty for my condition was not a fine or a royal pardon. It was death by stoning. I was carrying a death sentence in my womb, and the father of the child was the very man who held the power to drop the stones or cast the first one. I sent a frantic 3-word message to the king: "I am pregnant." I expected a collapse of his spirit, perhaps a public confession, or a plea for divine mercy. Instead, I witnessed the birth of a monster far more terrifying than any giant David had ever slain, the architect of deceit. David didn't come to comfort me. He came to strategize. I watched from the high balcony as he summoned my husband Uriah back from the front lines of Rabbah. It was a calculated, bloodless move on a chessboard of human lives. The plan was simple and sinister. If Uriah slept with me, the child would be considered his, and the king's sin would stay buried in the shadows forever. I will never forget the moment Uriah walked through those gates. He was covered in the dust of the battlefield, smelling of sweat leather and an unshakable honor. He was a man of light, and he was walking directly into a web of darkness, spun by the man he worshipped as his king. That night, David feasted him, plied him with wine, and urged him to go down to his house and wash his feet. It was a command disguised as a kindness, but Uriah was too noble for the trap. He refused to taste the comforts of a bed while his brothers in arms were sleeping in the dirt under the open sky. He slept on the cold stones of the palace gate among the servants. From my window, I watched him, my brave, loyal husband, lying on the hard ground just yards away from me, while the king's spies hovered in the shadows like vultures. The tension in the palace became a physical weight, a suffocating pressure in the air. Every time Uriah refused to enter our home, the king's desperation grew more volatile. I stood behind the heavy tapestries watching my husband's integrity collide with my king's cowardice. I wanted to scream, to run to him, to tell him that his loyalty was being used to weave his own shroud. But I was a prisoner of the crown. I realized then, with a sickening clarity, David was no longer trying to protect me. He was protecting his reputation. In the eyes of a king consumed by his own ego, a soldier's life is nothing more than a pawn to be sacrificed to keep a secret. The man after God's own heart was gone. In his place sat a man who would burn the world to hide his own fire. Desperation has a distinct scent. It smells like cold sweat and burning parchment. When Uriah refused to break his vow of solidarity with his troops, for a second night I saw the final flicker of humanity vanish from the king's eyes. David realized that he could not deceive an honorable man, so he decided to destroy him instead. I stood hidden behind the heavy cedar pillars of the royal hall, watching as the king dipped his quill into the ink. The scratching of the pen on the parchment sounded like a dagger sharpening against stone. In that moment, the man who wrote beautiful psalms to God was writing a death warrant for his most loyal servant. The plan was chilling in its simplicity. David folded the letter and sealed it with the royal signet. The hot red wax looked like a fresh drop of blood on the page. Then he called Uriah. I watched through a crack in the door, my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces, as the king handed the letter to my husband. "Take this to Joab," David said, his voice steady, showing no trace of the soul-crushing betrayal he was committing. Uriah, ever the faithful soldier, bowed low. He tucked the letter into his belt, the very letter that commanded his general to abandon him in the thick of the fiercest battle so that he would be struck down and die. I wanted to burst through those doors. I wanted to scream, "Don't take it, Uriah. It's a trap. He's killing you to hide me." But my feet were rooted in fear. I knew that one word from me would not save Uriah. It would only hasten our deaths. I watched from my window as my husband walked out of the palace gates for the last time. He walked with the posture of a hero, carrying his own execution order in his hands, oblivious to the fact that the king he lived for had already sentenced him to rot in the dirt. The cruelty of it was suffocating. David didn't just kill Uriah. He made Uriah a messenger of his own demise. As the dust of Jerusalem rose behind my husband's retreating figure, I felt a darkness settle over the city that no sun could ever pierce. The king returned to his wine, his secret seemingly safe, while I was left to count the days until the inevitable news of blood and dust would arrive. I was no longer just a victim of lust. I was an unwilling accomplice to a murder. The palace wasn't a home. It was a slaughterhouse, and the king was the butcher. Waiting is a special kind of torture, especially when you are waiting for a murder to be completed. Every morning for the next 7 days, I stood at the high window of my chamber, my eyes burning, as I searched the horizon for a messenger of dust. I was watching for the silhouette of a rider coming from the east, knowing that his arrival would mean my husband was dead and my shame was officially covered by the grave. David, meanwhile, moved through the palace with a chilling composure. He played his harp, he governed his people, and he even smiled at me, a smile that felt like a blade twisting in my heart. He acted as if the letter he had tucked into Uriah's belt was nothing more than a poem. The silence of the palace became deafening. Every time a door slammed or a soldier's boots echoed in the hallway, my heart stopped. I imagined the battlefield at Rabbah, The heat, the screams, and the moment Joab would give the order to retreat, leaving Uriah standing alone against a wall of enemies. I could almost feel the arrows piercing my own flesh. I spent my nights on the cold floor, torn between praying for Uriah's safety and realizing that his survival would mean my execution for adultery. The king had placed me in a position where I had to hope for my husband's death just to keep my own breath. It was a cruelty that no words could ever fully capture. I looked at the child growing inside me, and for the first time, I felt a wave of profound sorrow. This baby was being woven in a womb of grief, its life bought with the price of an innocent man's blood. I felt like a ghost trapped between two worlds, the world of the living, where David reigned with an iron fist, and the world of the dead, where Uriah was heading with a letter of betrayal in his hand. Then on the seventh day I saw him, a lone rider galloping toward the city, a trail of white dust rising behind him like a funeral shroud. My knees buckled. I didn't need to hear the words. The messenger wasn't bringing news of a war. He was bringing the confirmation of a slaughter. The king had won. The secret was safe. And my heart was officially a wasteland. The messenger arrived not with a trumpet's blare, but with the heavy dragging footsteps of a man carrying a curse. He stood before the king, his clothes torn, his face masked in the gray dust of the battlefield. I stood behind the heavy velvet curtains of the inner hall, my breath hitching as I listened to the report. He spoke of the fierce battle at the city wall, of the arrows that rained down like a plague, and then the words that severed my last link to the world I once knew. Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. I expected the king to flinch. I expected a moment of silence for the man who had died carrying David's own treachery. But instead, David's voice was as cold as a winter tomb. Do not let this thing displease you, he told the messenger, for the sword devours one as well as another. I wanted to scream until the palace walls crumbled. To him, Uriah wasn't a hero or a friend. He was an inconvenience that had been successfully removed. He spoke of the sword's hunger as if it were an act of fate, not an act of murder he had carefully choreographed from his own terrace. When the news was officially delivered to me, the world turned into a blur of black ash. I began the ritual of mourning, tearing my clothes and pouring dust over my head. But my tears were not just for a fallen husband. They were for the betrayal of everything holy. The palace was silent, yet in my mind, the screams of Uriah echoed through every hallway. I mourned for the man who died for a king who didn't deserve his shadow. I mourned for the child in my womb who would now be born into a house built on a foundation of bones. The period of mourning was short, too short. For David, it was merely a legal countdown, a formality to be checked off before he could claim his prize. Even as I sat in the dirt consumed by grief, I felt his eyes on me. He wasn't waiting for my heart to heal. He was waiting for the law to allow him to bring me into his bed permanently. The shame was gone, replaced by a royal marriage. But I realized then that the most dangerous place in Israel was not the battlefield. It was the heart of a king who had mistaken his power for the right to play God. The wedding bells were ringing, but to me, they sounded like a funeral dirge. For a year, the palace was silent, and it seemed the king had committed the perfect crime. I was now a queen, carrying the royal air, living in the very rooms where my nightmare began. David smiled at me, convinced that God was silent, and the world had forgotten Uriah's blood. But justice is not a fire that goes out. It is a coal that burns beneath the surface. The silence was finally broken, not by a soldier, but by an old man with eyes that saw through stone. Nathan the prophet arrived, and as he stood before the throne, the air in the room turned cold. He told a story of a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb. I watched from the shadows as David's face reddened with self-righteous anger. "The man who did this deserves to die," the king roared. In that heartbeat, the trap David had set for me and Uriah finally snapped shut on his own neck. Nathan pointed a trembling finger at the king and shouted the words that would echo through eternity. "You are the man." The secret was out. The king's mask shattered, and for the first time I saw David look small. I saw the giant slayer tremble under the weight of his own shadow. The judgment was swift and devastating. Nathan spoke of a sword that would never leave David's house, and a scandal that would be shouted from the rooftops. But the heaviest blow fell on the innocent. The child I had carried in grief, the life woven from blood and dust, became the ultimate price for the king's pride. For 7 days the baby lingered on the edge of life, and for 7 days I watched the king crawl in the dirt, begging for a mercy he had never shown to Uriah. When the child finally took its last breath, the silence that followed was louder than any scream. David moved on, eventually finding his way back to God's grace. But I remained. I am Bathsheba, the woman who saw the king behind the crown. I lived to see my son Solomon sit on the throne, but every time I look out the palace window, I don't see the glory of a kingdom. I see the rooftop where it all began. I see the dust of a messenger's feet. I see the cost of being wanted by a man who thought he was a god. David's sin was forgiven by heaven, but the shadows in the hallways of this palace will forever whisper the name of the man who died for a king's secret. History is often written by the powerful, but the truth lives in the shadows they leave behind. If you want to explore the untold stories of faith, the silent voices of the past, and the dark corners of history that the world tried to forget, then join our journey. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of the human soul. What other secrets do you think are hidden behind the crown? Let us know in the comments below.